Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Moroccan Wealth's podcast. Today, we're diving into a captivating and timely topic. After a brief introduction, we'll explore the significant footprint Morocco has made in African diplomacy. Stay tuned as we uncover the intricate ways Morocco is shaping the diplomatic landscape across the continent.
Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty interesting. Morocco's growing diplomatic clout in Africa.
Yeah.
You know, we always hear about like the big global players, but Morocco is quietly becoming a force to be reckoned with, and I think it's really important to understand like why.
Absolutely.
And we've got a ton of sources here, diplomatic reports, policy documents, quotes from, key players. And they're all pointing to like a pretty big shift in how Morocco is approaching its relationships in Africa.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's definitely a move away from those kind of like, old school handshake and treaty models of diplomacy.
Like the really traditional ones.
Exactly. And what's so interesting to me is how Morocco is really like weaving together economic partnerships, cultural exchanges, security collaborations, all into like this very strategic and frankly like effective approach. I mean, it's changing the whole dynamic across the continent.
Yeah, and it's not just about like signing agreements, right? It's about like building deeper connections.
For sure.
I was really struck by how they're focusing on economic partnerships that go beyond just like aid or one-off projects.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you can see this in action with initiatives like the what is it?
Oh, yeah.
The Nouakchott-Dakar Highway project. Yeah. That's a massive infrastructure undertaking, and it's connecting key cities across West Africa. And it's a perfect example of how Morocco is investing in these projects that boost trade, facilitate regional integration, and really have a real impact on people's lives.
Yeah, and speaking of impact, their work in renewable energy really caught my eye.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're not just building solar farms and wind turbines, like they're sharing that expertise with other African nations, helping them transition to cleaner energy.
Yeah.
It's smart, especially with climate change.
It is. It's really smart. And they're positioning themselves as a leader in sustainable development. And that really resonates with a lot of African countries that are trying to figure out, okay, how do we deal with these environmental issues?
Right.
So it's a strategic way to build partnerships and demonstrate a commitment to like a shared future.
It is a shared future for everybody.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the economics and infrastructure, right?
No, not at all.
I was really intrigued by how Morocco is using cultural exchange to like strengthen its ties across the continent.
This is where they really leverage their rich cultural heritage and their position as this kind of bridge between Africa and the Arab world.
Right.
Think about initiatives like the Marrakech International Film Festival.
Oh, yeah.
Which showcases African cinema to a global audience.
It's a world.
Or, they do collaborations with universities across the continent, fostering educational exchanges and intellectual dialogue.
Right. So it's much more like a
holistic. It's a holistic
approach than we typically see.
Yeah, you don't often see that kind of multi-pronged approach.
Yeah, and then they're bringing security into the mix too.
Yes, exactly. And that's fascinating too. They're taking a very proactive approach to counterterrorism efforts.
Makes sense.
Because they recognize that regional stability is critical.
For everybody.
For everyone, exactly. And they've also been active in UN and AU peacekeeping missions further cementing their role as a responsible partner in these security concerns.
So they're not shying away from the tough stuff.
No, they're not.
It's really interesting. I'm curious, like, how does it all fit together? Do they have like a master plan or a vision for what they're trying to
It's a good question.
achieve?
Well, I mean, they definitely have a long-term vision for like a more integrated and prosperous Africa. And their diplomatic strategy is very much aligned with that goal, but I don't think it's like this rigid master plan. You know, it's more like this
more organic,
flexible and adaptive approach. They're identifying opportunities to collaborate. They're building trust. They're strategically positioning themselves as a key player in shaping the future of the continent.
It makes you wonder if this model diplomacy could be replicated by other nations, or if there's something unique about Morocco's position.
That's a great question.
That's enabling them to do this.
It is. It's a question we should keep in mind. As we go forward, right? But I think what you're seeing here is how Morocco is challenging these traditional notions of diplomacy and forging a new path, one that's rooted in collaboration, mutual benefit, and this shared vision for a stronger Africa. Which I think is really
interesting,
compelling.
It's really interesting to see how Morocco's like using all these different tools of diplomacy. But I'm also curious about like the concrete results. Are these initiatives actually like making a difference on the ground?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where things get even more interesting. Let's take their work with solar energy. You mentioned earlier their massive solar farms and wind turbines. Well, one particular striking project is the Noor Power Station. In Ouarzazate. It's one of the largest concentrated solar power plants in the world.
Wow.
And it's providing clean energy to millions of Moroccans.
That's amazing.
While also reducing the country's reliance on fossil fuels.
That's huge, but it sounds like it mostly benefits Morocco, right?
Right.
How does this tie into their diplomatic strategy with other African nations?
That's the really clever part. They're not keeping this knowledge and technology to themselves. Through initiatives like the African Solar Energy Initiative, Morocco is actively sharing its expertise and providing technical assistance to other countries in the region, like Senegal and Gambia, who are also looking to develop their own renewable energy resources.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just about Morocco winning, it's about helping other African nations succeed.
Exactly. It's about fostering a sense of shared progress and creating like a win-win situation for everyone involved.
I like that.
And this approach extends beyond renewable energy. For instance, Moroccan banks like Attijari Wafa Bank are expanding their operations across Africa, providing much-needed financing for businesses and infrastructure projects in countries that often struggle to attract investment.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, access to capital is so crucial.
It's essential
for economic development.
Absolutely.
And it sounds like Morocco is kind of stepping in to fill that gap. But I'm wondering about the potential challenges. Like, doesn't this kind of involvement, especially in the financial sector, risk being perceived as like neocolonialism?
Right. That's a valid concern, and it's a critique that's sometimes leveled at Morocco's approach. However, I think it's important to note that these investments and partnerships are often framed as mutually beneficial collaborations rather than, top-down directives. Morocco emphasizes respect for sovereignty and local ownership, and they often structure their investments in ways that ensure that local communities benefit directly.
So it's like a delicate balancing act.
It is. It's a delicate balancing act. They're trying to be a supportive partner while also avoiding the pitfalls of past approaches that were often seen as exploitative. It's a complex dynamic, and there's no easy answer. But I think it's worth noting that many African leaders welcome Morocco's involvement, seeing it as a pragmatic and effective way to address their own development challenges.
So we've talked about how Morocco is working to like promote economic development and tackle things like climate change. But what about their role in addressing some of these other pressing challenges facing the region, like migration and conflict?
Well, on the migration front, Morocco has taken a rather nuanced approach. They recognize that migration is a complex issue with deep roots in economic disparities, political instability and social factors.
Right.
So instead of simply trying to like seal off their borders, they've adopted a strategy that combines border security with a focus on human rights and social integration.
So they're trying to like manage migration in a way that like benefits Morocco,
right,
but also the migrants themselves.
Yes, and they're doing this through various initiatives. For example, they've implemented programs to foster economic opportunities in migrants' home countries.
Okay.
Trying to address those root causes of migration.
Right.
They've also created legal pathways for migration, providing opportunities for people to come to Morocco legally to work or to study.
So it's a more holistic and humane approach.
Yeah, it's a more holistic and humane approach than we often see.
Than we typically see.
In other parts of the world. And they've also been active in working with European countries to develop more effective migration management strategies, recognizing that this is a shared challenge that requires international cooperation.
That makes sense. What about their role in conflict resolution?
Right.
The sources we've been looking at mentioned that Morocco has been pretty active in mediating disputes and promoting peace in the region.
Yes, that's another area where Morocco has really sought to leverage its diplomatic skills and its position as kind of a neutral and respected player.
Right.
They've played a mediating role in conflicts in Mali, Libya, and even further afield in the Middle East.
Right.
And they often emphasize dialogue, compromise, finding common ground, even in situations where tensions are really high.
So do you have like a specific example of where their mediation efforts have been particularly successful?
One notable case is their involvement in helping to resolve the political crisis in Gambia back in 2016. Okay.
When former President Yahya Jammeh refused to step down after losing an election.
Oh, right.
It threatened to plunge the country into chaos, and Morocco played a key role in persuading Jammeh to eventually relinquish power and go into exile.
Wow.
Helping to avert a potential disaster.
So they're not just talking about peace. They're actually
they're taking concrete steps.
Yes,
to help resolve conflicts and prevent violence.
It's pretty impressive.
It does suggest a commitment to regional stability and a willingness to use their diplomatic clout for the greater good.
Right.
But of course, not all of their efforts are met with success, and there are times when their involvement in regional affairs is met with skepticism or even resistance.
Yeah, I can imagine that's probably...
It's inevitable
when you're dealing with such complex and sensitive issues.
But it seems like they're really trying to make a positive...
I think so. Yeah, and I think that's what makes Morocco's approach to African diplomacy so fascinating. They're not afraid to engage with the tough challenges, to try new approaches, and to really kind of push the boundaries of what traditional diplomacy looks like.
It's a new way of doing it.
Yeah, and whether you agree with all of their actions or not, they're undoubtedly a force to be reckoned with.
Right.
And a key player shaping the future of the African continent.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive into Morocco's role in African diplomacy.
Sounds good.
What are your final thoughts as we kind of bring this part of the exploration to a close?
What really stands out to me is the ambition and the long-term vision that's driving Morocco's strategy.
Yeah.
They're not just looking for quick fixes or short-term gains.
Right.
They're investing in building a more integrated, prosperous, and stable Africa, and they're using all the tools at their disposal.
All the tools.
To achieve that goal. It's a fascinating case study in how a nation can leverage its resources, its culture, and its diplomatic skills to make a real difference on the global stage.
And it's a story that's still unfolding.
Right.
Right? I mean, we've only just scratched the surface of this complex, evolving landscape.
Absolutely. Morocco's role in African diplomacy is a story worth watching.
It is.
And it's a story that has the potential to shape the future of the entire continent for years to come.
As we wrap up this deep dive on Morocco's diplomacy in Africa, I'm really struck by just how broad their engagement is.
Yeah.
We've talked about economic partnerships.
Right.
Cultural exchanges, security cooperation. It's like they're playing on all these different levels.
Yeah, it is. It's a multifaceted approach for sure. And I think that's part of what makes it so effective. They're not like putting all their eggs in one basket.
Yeah.
They're really weaving together all these different strands of diplomacy to create this very strong and resilient web of connections.
And you can see how that really resonates with other African nations. It's not just Morocco coming in and saying like, hey, we know what's best for you. It's more about, hey, let's work together to figure this out.
Yeah.
Like, what works for both of us?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. It's about building these partnerships based on mutual respect and shared interests. And I think that's a refreshing change from the more transactional or even exploitative relationships that have often characterized interactions between Africa and the outside world.
It feels very modern.
It does. It feels like a much more modern approach to diplomacy.
I'm curious about the long-term implications of all of this. Like, where do you see Morocco's role in Africa heading the future?
Well, it's tough to predict the future with any certainty, but I think it's safe to say that Morocco is really positioning itself to be a major player in shaping the African continent for years to come.
Mm-hmm.
All their investments, their partnerships, their diplomatic efforts, they're laying the groundwork for a more integrated, prosperous, and influential Africa.
So this is not a short-term play at all.
No, they're playing
decades ahead.
The long game, absolutely. They have a long-term vision, and they're executing it strategically.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the key takeaways from this whole deep dive is that Morocco is demonstrating that a nation can exert influence and achieve its goals not through force or coercion, but through collaboration, partnership, and a genuine commitment to shared progress.
It's pretty inspiring, honestly, and it makes you wonder, could this be a model for other regions of the world that are facing similar challenges? Like, could this work in the Middle East or Southeast Asia?
That's a great question, and it's one that deserves further exploration.
Right.
I think there are definitely some elements of Morocco's approach that could be adapted and applied in other contexts. The emphasis on building trust, fostering dialogue, identifying those shared interests. These are principles that are universally relevant.
But there are also some pretty unique factors at play here, right? I mean, Morocco's history, its culture, its geographic position, all of those things kind of contribute to its ability to play this particular role in Africa.
Oh, absolutely. You're absolutely right. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think Morocco's experience offers some really valuable lessons and insights that can inform diplomatic efforts in other parts of the world.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to ponder. We've seen how Morocco is leveraging its unique position and its strategic approach to kind of reshape the dynamics of African diplomacy.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is, what does this mean for the future of the continent? Will this lead to a more prosperous and united Africa as Morocco envisions? Or are there potential downsides and unintended consequences that we need to be aware of?
Those are the big questions, aren't they?
Yeah.
And I don't think we have all the answers yet, but one thing is clear. Morocco's role in Africa is a story that's still being written, and it's a story that has the potential to shape the destiny of an entire continent.
So well said.
Oh.
And on that note, we'll leave it to our listeners to keep exploring, dig deeper.
Absolutely.
Draw their own conclusions.
Keep those minds curious, folks.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive. Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.